Hi, everybody. Welcome. We've got a great call today. Very excited about this information. Very excited about our guest. You actually know him, though you don't know him, and you're going to see why you do know him in a second. His name is Roland Angle. He's an engineer. He's with Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And this is the organization that has done all the heavy lifting to help us understand with no shadow of a doubt that the cover story for 9/11 is physically impossible. And he's going to talk about his work, the work of the organization. The website, by the way, I think everybody knows it, but in case you don't, it's ae911truth.org. And he's going to talk about their work and also the suppression of their work. And this seems to be a theme in modern society. We're told to follow the science unless the science doesn't say what we want it to say. So Roland, thank you so much for joining us. You're a hero to me, and I know even if people don't know you yet, they know your work because we've all seen it and we've all benefited from it tremendously.
Well, thank you for having me on, Ken. I really appreciate your continuing efforts to bring information to the public that is unfortunately not widely disseminated for various reasons. And I do want to emphasize that everything that I am going to speak about today has been the result of literally tens of thousands of hours of research by our volunteers. We represent 3,500 architects and engineers and building professionals who are trying to uncover the truth for the American public as to what happened to the 3 high-rise buildings at the World Trade Center in New York City on September 11, 2001. So I want to give all credit to our great staff and our tremendous volunteer effort that has brought this evidence to light after the last 15 years of research.
You know, in a sense, you guys are showing the way for what needs to be done now with the public health scam. We need doctors, biologists, statisticians to come together the way you guys have come together. You know, coordinate, produce the research, make it available to those who are willing to listen. But we don't have that yet. And let me ask you this. And we're sort of mixing stories here in a sense, but a lot of doctors are afraid to speak out because they're afraid it will injure their career prospects. I have to imagine that something similar, possible risks to the members of your group who've been courageous and been willing to take a hard line and tell the truth.
It's a fact that people that are still, in the professions, we seem to be having a crisis in all of our professions, whether it be legal, whether it be medical, whether it be engineering, across the board, people that have attained some rank in those professions have invested a tremendous amount of their time and effort and money to get to where they are. And it's not an easy thing to run up against the orthodoxy of your profession, which in many cases is controlled by large money grants from corporations and government agencies that can punish you if you say things that might embarrass them or call into question the judgments and the decisions that they have made. So we have, in our particular case, probably the majority of people that are active in our organization are retired, like myself. I was a professional engineer in California for 50 years, but at this point I'm retired, and I have the relative luxury of being able to speak out without having some financial repercussions visited upon me by the establishment. And engineering in particular happens to be a profession where we rely on large projects that are typically funded by large organizations, whether they be private or whether they be governmental. So we have that that burden that we have to bear. The question of how do you speak the truth when that truth may come back and cause you great personal loss and damage? That's a difficult decision for people to make. And I am going to use my position, since I'm relatively insulated from all that, to be able to speak for those who would like to speak, but are not able to because of responsibilities that they have to their families and so on.
Well, I have to think, you imagine you're a 40-year-old guy, you're in the middle of your career, you have a growing family. And as you point out, to be an engineer, you're not working for it's not a bake sale level operation. Every engineering project is huge. And so its large money interests are going to be behind virtually every project out there. And I imagine somebody could find themselves blackballed from professions, from projects.
Certainly happens, and it has happened.
So there are people that have already paid this price professionally for telling the truth about engineering.
Definitely.
Amazing.
It's happened.
Amazing. Amazing. You mentioned the orthodoxy. Who would be some examples of the so-called engineering orthodoxy who are controlling the narrative?
There are large-scale professional organizations, the largest of which in our field is the American Society of Civil Engineers. And they've been around since the mid-19th century. Civil engineering is the oldest of all the engineering professions, goes back a couple of thousand years, as we know from the great aqueducts and roads and such that the Romans and other civilizations built a couple of thousand years ago. So we have a long history of advancing our profession through examining scientific evidence and conducting experiments and learning from our failures how to better serve the public interest. Civil engineering is differentiated from military engineering, which the first engineers were military, and they were learning how to design weapons and defense against weapons in warfare. That was probably the first real engineering efforts. And so we have, as I say, a long history of learning from our past mistakes and studying and putting forth theories. And we go to school for extensive periods of time to learn how these things have developed historically and how to apply them in our modern day setting. So we've got a long history of this. And when we see a failure, we study that failure, because this gives us an opportunity to learn like no other situation does, really. So when we see 3 buildings come down at the World Trade Center and they're high-rise steel frame structures, and their alleged failure is due to what has been termed office fires, or fires in the case of the towers, the fires started by the fuel from the planes that hit the buildings. At any rate, fires of any type or sort bringing down high-rise steel structures has never happened. And we've been building steel high-rise buildings since the early 20th century. So we've got about 100 years of experience behind us. And when we see something like that happen, it's an extraordinary event, which the government admitted. They said these are never before seen events. When you've got an event that has never been seen before, you want to learn from that event, because this is something that is a teaching moment for you. So you want to study this and understand what happened. And what we've seen happen since that day is that the government funded some studies and paid some contractors to do some studies, and they won't release the results of those studies. Their analyses that they performed are being hidden from our profession and from the public at large. And this is completely counter to thousands of years of experience. We don't study failures and then hide the results. That's not how we learn.
I had no idea that they had actually conducted studies that they're hiding. This is big news to me. It might be news to some of our listeners too. This is incredible.
Well, it is hidden. and the public, and here's the thing, our professional organizations that are supposed to be standing up for our professional ethical responsibilities have been complicit in this. And it's not in the best interest of our members and our rank and file engineers to have this information hidden from them. So that's one of the jobs that we've taken on, is to publicize this information so that not only the public, but there are actually a lot of members of our profession that are unaware of the implications and the methodologies that have been used to keep this information essentially hidden in plain sight.
And I'd like to talk about some of those mechanisms, but one thing I just want to highlight to everybody: civilization is made possible by civil engineers. You take away civil engineering from the equation, and we don't have civilization anymore. We don't have fresh water. We don't have sewage. We don't have buildings that stand up. We don't have roads. All these things that are the props for our modern life disappear. So the idea of interfering with the practice of civil engineering is mind-boggling, and it's terrible. And let's take the idea of a catastrophic structure collapse. Let's say their story of events is plausible. Let's assume that nonsense. Shouldn't we be figuring out how to make sure that never happens again? That no fire could, if they literally believe that all it takes is a small fire on a few floors of the high-rise to create a collapse of a high-rise, shouldn't that be the greatest research project in the history of civil engineering, figuring out how we're going to prevent that from happening? Because theoretically, that could be happening again all over the world. So right on the face of it, they clearly don't have any interest in doing their jobs.
Well, let me say that there have been some studies. When the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which was the government agency that was tasked with studying the collapse of the buildings, came out with their reports. They came out with their report on the towers in 2005 and the report on Building 7 in 2008. And they had something like 40 recommendations for code changes and procedural events that went into the design and construction of these buildings that was supposed to address these concerns. However, what we found in studying these so-called recommendations is that many of them were not implemented in the first place. The ICC, International Code Convention for Building Codes, has not adopted any of the recommendations that had to do with structural changes of the building. And the reason they haven't is because they don't have any merit. The recommendations that they're making, in the first place, if you have a false understanding of why the buildings failed, and you come out with some recommendations that are based upon trying to fix those false ideas, then when people really examine them, they say, well, this really doesn't have any merit.
Wow.
So the ICC has not developed any changes that in pertaining to the structures themselves. They adopted some things in terms of, oh, well, maybe you should have better egress so the building can be emptied out more quickly. Maybe you should look at the fireproofing on the steel and see if that can be improved a bit. And they did some minor tweaking like that. But they didn't say, listen, you can't build a building in this particular way that failed, because there's no merit to that suggestion. So the very fact that they haven't implemented any changes regarding the actual structures themselves is an indication that the information that they were getting from Nist has no merit. Otherwise, they would have made the changes.
Wow. So this is a leading or the leading organization for setting building standards. And they looked at I guess we should call them politicized cosmetic recommendations, and looked at them and said, these don't make any sense. We're not going to implement them. Now, easier egress, well, that always makes sense. Why would you not want to make it easier for people to get out of buildings? So that wasn't, that's not an example of them adopting the 9/11 fake engineering standards. That's just saying, well, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Let's make a greater effort to allow people to get out of buildings quicker in an emergency. Wow, that's amazing. So I've just learned two big things today, that there were careful studies done and that they are being hidden, and that the international standard setting for building construction has looked at the recommendations and I guess said we're not going to go with them because they're not essential. So we're really talking about politicized engineering here, where the government has decided to rewrite the rules of engineering to fulfill some sort of agenda, and they're doing their best to enforce it. But luckily, at least some branches of engineering are saying, no, we're not going along with the recommendations. Are there other groups? So we've got the Association of Engineers, the oldest association. Are there other main power structures within the profession that are complicit with this, I guess, as we would say?
I would say that, yeah, there are other professional organizations. There's the National Society of Professional Engineers, the NSPE, and they're another large engineering organization, they're more concerned with things like contracts and ethics and so on and so forth. So they've been drawn into this essentially by the leadership of the American Society of Civil Engineers, which took a position early on that they were, in first place, they were heavily involved in the actual government studies themselves. Many of their members and leading contributors were people that were hired and or volunteered to participate in the studies of why the buildings came down immediately after the event. So, and I'll get into that in a minute. I want to go into what that process was like. Another organization that is very significant is the Society of the Structural Engineers Association. Structural Engineers Association are the very specific specialty within civil engineering that would be the most concerned and the most involved about the failure of steel frame structure. So they are a separate organization. They have independent state-owned chapters that I think there's 26 or 27 states that have SEA chapters. And they are not so much of a top-down organization. The American Society of Civil Engineers has a national organization that is very closely oversees the local organizations at the state and regional levels. Whereas the SEA, the Structural Engineers Association, is more of a confederation where the independent state organizations are more independent and less dependent upon the national organization. There is a National Council of Structural Engineers Association, but they don't have the kind of top-down control of the state organizations that the ASCE does. So I would say these three organizations, the ASCE, the NSPE, and the SEA, those three organizations are the fundamental organizations that were involved at some level with the study and the examination of the evidence of what happened at the World Trade Center. So those three organizations were key in responding and being part of the studies, and also taking positions afterwards as to the efficacy of those studies. So those are the organizations that we've been focusing on.
Gotcha.
In terms of trying to get our message out to their members.
How would those groups be subverted? In other words, I imagine if you put a strong hand in charge of any one of those groups, that person would have a lot of influence and be able to, I'm trying to figure out how these important institutions got so corrupted that they refuse to look at science and physics. I'm just wondering what the mechanism might have been.
I think the fundamental mechanism is economics. Most of these folks are, I mean, the ASCE has been criticized. I talked to many of the members. We've made presentations to about 1,000 engineers across the country in the last couple of years. And I've talked to a lot of these guys and a lot of these people, and they are, within the profession, there are people that decide that they're going to try to climb the ladder up of the professional organizations and become significant people in those organizations. So they are the activists at the local level and the state level and the national level, and they are typically come from companies that are doing large amounts of large businesses. That is, they've been in charge of big projects funded by corporations or government, and therefore there's a natural affinity for them to look at things from the perspective of those organizations. And they're able to collaborate with those organizations, and it becomes an economic, political relationship that they have. I mean, the ASCE headquarters is located on the East Coast, right outside of Washington, D.C., and they lobby. They lobby the government for money, for funding, for large infrastructure projects, whether it's dams, roads, bridges. This is a lobbying organization on one level, so it has a political aspect to it. And that political aspect can come into play in a case where you have, in this case, an attack that brought down major structures, caused large-scale loss of life, and had political implications from the very moment that it happened. It resulted in political decisions that involved the U.S. going to war, sending troops, people dying, spending trillions of dollars. These are all political manifestations that were centered on the failure, quote, failure of large structures and cost people their lives. So the political influence on engineering has always been there from the very beginning. As I said earlier, the early engineers were designing weapons. These were political events, right? Wars.
Sure.
So our history is intertwined with political events, and in cases where our expertise has proven to be at the center of events that had large political repercussions, then we have a difficult time separating out our professional responsibilities and obligations from the political aspects of that sprang from that event. And that's what we're involved in here. It's very difficult for us to look at these events without some political perspective. And I would like to point out that there have been a lot of studies besides the government studies that Nist performed and paid for by contractors that were used to doing business with the U.S. government. There have been studies that were done overseas by academics in other countries. And believe me, they have quite a different perspective on what happened to those three buildings than we do here. And we can see how that political evidence, that political influence plays out. So we're here, we have to contend with the U.S. government and the corporate alliance with the government and all the economic and political manifestations that flow from that. But we are trying to focus on our professional responsibilities to the public in terms of understanding why things fail and making sure that they don't happen again. And we're trying to say we're not involved in these other aspects of it. We can't be. We can't begin to talk about the political and economic ramifications of what happened that day. We will talk about the performance of those structures and what made them collapse. That is our field of expertise, and we will present that evidence as clearly and as unambiguously and objectively as we possibly can. And that's what we're trying to do. That's our responsibility.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And you're not being blocked from doing your research and analysis. You have your 3,500 members all working towards that aim to use the professional skills of civil engineering to analyze what happened. And this is what they do. This is what they're trained to do. This is what many of them have done for decades. So there's no question of lack of expertise. So the issue is not doing the research. It's not accumulating the research. It's getting the research to the public.
And it's getting it published within our own organization, because the organizations that we're confronting in terms of the decisions that they've made and the positions that they've taken, they control the lifeblood of our organization is our literature and our communications within the profession to one another. They held conferences, there's seminars that they hold, webinars, so on and so forth, and we're being blocked from presenting in those arenas so that we can reach our intended targets, our fellow professionals, with our message. And that's where the rub lies, that this top-down decision-making made by people that were involved in the investigation with the government. They have an axe to grind. Not all of them, of course. Again, I want to point out that I think the overwhelming majority of our profession is honest and has integrity. However, I think that there are a few people that were placed or were already in positions where they could make critical decisions involving the direction of the investigations that made those decisions in such a way as to lead the investigation to conclusions that are not consistent with the scientific evidence. And that is the problem.
And unfortunately, the way things are structured, the society is the logical place that one would go for the analysis, because this is the society of all of our civil engineers. It's over 100 years old. These are our best guys. Let's get them to analyze it. And what we're not aware of, those of us who are on the outside, is that this engineering society is by necessity, I guess, or by nature, not necessity, by nature, a highly politicized organization, not the members of the profession, but the administration of the society. And you made a point that there are some people that practice engineering, and there are some people that practice the politics of engineering. In other words, I want to get high on the totem pole of the engineering society. That's a different agenda than wanting to be a great engineer or wanting to be a diligent engineer. That's a political aspiration. It's almost like it's a political class of people that have risen to the top of this engineering society, and they are making their deals with the other members of the political class, whether it be from large corporations or from the government side. They're all in agreement about how things need to be handled. And unfortunately, those fellows have taken control of your society, or have control of your society. Am I expressing this situation?
Yeah, I think that's a fairly accurate portrayal. I just think that in any, and I would say in all professions, there are people that are more political minded. They're more, yeah. They think, and a lot of them are well motivated. They think, well, I'm going to do what I can do to make my profession more accountable, more effective, more accurate, more scientific, etc. But there are others that look to feather their own nest, for lack of a better word. They enjoy the prestige. They like being in administrative positions. They don't maybe like the technical aspects of it as much. They find it repetitive, boring, or whatever after some time. And they look to other areas where they can apply their skills. And these are people that have, generally speaking, they're people they have more people skills. They're mm-hmm. more political in nature. That's the way they operate. I think that's an age-old human condition. You know, who are politicians? Why do they become politicians? Right. What is it that motivates them? Many of them are, I'm sure, honest, well-meaning people. They want to do the best for the best amount of people. But, and I'm sure there are many people in the engineering profession that operate the same way. Unfortunately, there are some people that can be enticed or incentivized in some way, coerced even, into behaving in these critical situations in a manner that is not consistent with what our professional values are. And they actually are, for one reason or another, betray us.
And they somehow are able to wield significant organizational power, right? There's probably just a small handful of people that determine the direction of the Society of Civil Engineering.
Yeah, they once you get into a position at the upper levels, every decision that you make has vast consequences. It affects a large number of people because it's going to determine what kind of information they get and whether or not they're going to get that information at all. So these are huge decisions that involve heavy ethical requirements and consequences. And, you know, they only should be, if you get to that position, hopefully you're a person that's trustworthy and has some integrity. Doesn't always happen that way.
Gotcha. And something that I hadn't really thought about, not only is the public being denied this information, but the profession itself, practitioners of the profession who would benefit from knowing the results of these studies, you're being blocked, your organization is being blocked from publishing, disseminating, sharing the information. I mean, let's say we won't even say you're right, you know, we won't even go there, but you guys have an opinion. You have something based on research, based on decades of experience, based on tens of thousands of hours of research. Why can't it be heard? Why can't it be disseminated? Why can't it be published? If it is a matter up for debate, why can't it be debated? This is the clue that there's something very wrong, that they're blocking the very discussion.
Exactly. I mean, our position is this. If we were wrong, the reason why we feel so strongly that we're right is because our research indicates, and our science and our understanding and our experience and our background and our education, everything leads to this conclusion. However, above and beyond that, the fact that they won't allow this discussion to take place is an indication that they don't have any arguments that can counter what we have to say. If they had the arguments that they could show to the profession and say, well, here's where they're wrong, and they're wrong here, and they're wrong here, and they could debate this back and forth with some chance that their opinion would prevail and would actually have some reality to the members, they would do that. And the fact that they're not doing that is an indication that there's really something serious wrong. Always the suppression of debate is a serious problem because it indicates that something is wrong, where people that have power and authority don't want to have a discussion about what the subject matter is. It's an indication that they really don't have anything to say that's going to be convincing.
Yeah, I would encourage people who perhaps wisely say, well, I'm not an engineer and I don't really know the math and the physics and the practicality of all this. So I don't have an opinion one way or the other. Okay, that's a fair position to take. But if you are taking that position, anybody listening, I would encourage you to look at the fact that serious practitioners of civil engineering who've spent tens of thousands of hours studying this are being blocked from advancing their position. This is a smoking gun, to say the least.
Instead, it's being inferred, if sometimes even spoken openly, that we are, quote, conspiracy theorists. Mm-hmm. And somehow our minds have been taken over by an insane and irrational belief that that our understanding of our training and our experience is somehow not effective anymore. We've been taken over by some spirit of
irrationality.
So this is a method for dismissing debate and not having a back and forth over what the facts are and what these facts indicate. It's a substitute for any kind of real debate. And anytime the notion, conspiracy theories have been really inflated in the last couple of decades. I would say going back 40 or 50 years now, conspiracy theories have been used to disincentivize people from looking at the evidence themselves and making up their own mind. So it's something that we have to contend with, and that's one of the reasons why we focus so closely on the evidence itself, and we don't try to get off into the other aspects of this, because it only gives people that are opposing us ammunition to point at us and say, well, see, they're talking about this, or they're talking about that over there. They're just they're conspiracy theorists.
Gotcha. And in a normal course of events, you'd have a professional society that would be keenly interested in the education and the professional development of its members, and you would create a mechanism by which people who are doing interesting and important research would have a platform to share that research with other members. So your organization and your members are even, you're being blocked from sharing what you've discovered with other members of your profession. I mean, they're not literally, barring the door if you were to show up at somebody's office and want to talk with them, but they basically own the central clearinghouse of information that everybody depends on and uses within the profession. And by denying you a platform there, they're essentially cutting off the entire profession from getting access to this research.
That's exactly what's going on. We in the last 3 years ago, we formed a committee called Project Due Diligence. And Project Due Diligence is our outreach to the engineering community, and specifically the engineering community. And our approach is to go out to the local chapters and to request that we have a presentation to make. We have a PowerPoint presentation. We'll come and we'll present our evidence. And we are calling for a new and independent investigation into the failure of these 3 buildings. And these are the reasons why. And as I said earlier, we've made this presentation to something like 1,000 engineers up until now at this point in the local chapters. And we've yet to meet one single one of those engineers that has said, we disagree, we think that the Nist investigations are sufficient and accurate and correct. Once they hear what we have to say, they agree that it's time to look at this again. What we need to do, and we're going to sharpen our message now, is to encourage those engineers that we are reaching at the local level to become more active in demanding from the national leadership that they change their position. Because the national leadership, once they began to realize that we were reaching out to the local organizations, they issued a national statement, actually anonymously. It's never signed by anybody, never dated, but it says that, listen, we were involved in the initial study by Nist, and we were sent a lot of our top experts. It was done scientifically, professionally, and we think it's accurate, and we would encourage you to stand by that government investigation. So they discourage the local chapters from listening to what we have to say. And we've actually had local chapters accept us to come and speak and make our presentation. And then once they heard from the national organization, they called us back up and said, no, we're canceling. So they are actively preventing us. We've offered to present this information to conferences and the national conferences, state conferences, and so on. And when the national leadership gets hold of that information, they prevent us from appearing. So they are actively involved in blocking the information that we have to say, and they don't have any good reason for doing so. They've never countered us by saying, well, we believe that this piece of information that you're presenting is false or not factual or unscientific or whatever. There's never been any of that. There's never been any engagement as to the material that we're presenting. It's always about well, we did the studies and we participated in them, and therefore there's no need to study them further. That's not an argument.
Wow.
Sorry.
No problem. You mentioned that the structural engineers have a little bit more independence. Are you having greater luck speaking to their local chapters?
Well, we did get in front of the state organization in Arizona, and it was very well received. It was done by actually Leroy Halsey, a professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. 5 years ago, we gave a grant to the University of Alaska at Fairbanks to study Building 7 in particular. And Professor Halsey is a structural engineer there, and he conducted that study with two of his graduate students, a 4-year study. And he came to the conclusion that the Nist study that the building came down due to fires was not plausible, and that the only thing that could have brought the building down the way it did come down would be the simultaneous removal of all the columns in the building over 8 floors, which he didn't say that directly, but the only method by which he would do that would be a controlled demolition using explosives. So his study was open for public comment and peer review for 6 months. Nobody from Nist responded. Nobody that was involved in any of their studies, any of their contractors responded and took issue with any of the findings of his report. They had their opportunity. We sent it out to all the engineering institutions at all the major academic colleges and universities in the country. We only got one response to come and discuss the findings, and that was from Morgan State University, a small university in Baltimore, and they allowed us to come and speak, and they had speakers from Nist the year before. So that was the one exception that we had to the entire academic structure. I took it back with Professor Halsey to my alma mater. I graduated from UC Berkeley, and we made a presentation there and publicized it well in advance. And there was not one single engineering professor from the engineering department that showed up for that presentation. So there's clearly,
wow.
Clearly, I mean, the silence is deafening here.
Who did attend? What kind of people did students attend? Public?
We got some students to attend. Unfortunately, this is another unusual occurrence. The student chapter of the American Society of Civil Engineers, they have student chapters in all the major universities. They, as soon as they found out that we were coming with our presentation, they planned another event at exactly the same time on the same day with free food and so on to get the students to go to that. And so the turnout that we got from students was relatively low. So there was, I mean, this was the ASCE chapter should have been encouraging people to come and see this presentation on a major engineering failure in our time that was still unresolved, and yet they took a position that it was more important to go and hear somebody else talk about something else and get free food that day. So these are things that, again, there's a lot of very suspicious activity that goes on when you get into the nuts and bolts of trying to get this information out. And, you know, it's just something that we've learned to, just something we have to deal with. We're not surprised by it anymore.
Well, just to recap, they're not only hiding or suppressing or disappearing research that they've done, right? There's research that, so that's being, it's almost like these some of these pharma things. Oh, well, we'll tell you about the vaccine 70 years from now. We'll tell you about how we made it 70 or some. They've got some crazy things going on there too, where they're suppressing public, which should be public information. But they're also blocking you from normal intellectual commerce. You know, they won't publish your papers. They won't, you know, give you opportunities to speak at conferences. And to take it to another level, it appears that they're actively interfering with your efforts to speak to other members of your profession.
Very definitely so. I mean, we have the evidence, we have the written evidence, we have their directives, again, which are always suspiciously, I mean, they're disseminated, but they're not signed, they're not dated. It comes down through electronic communication to the local from the national level, but there's nobody taking responsibility for it, because nobody in their right mind would take responsibility for it, because it would definitely implicate them in unethical behavior. And so all these things are done anonymously and behind the scenes.
Wow. So you have this current initiative to get in front of as many of the local chapters of engineering groups as possible. Anything else that you're working on that we should know about?
Well, we have on that technical front, we've submitted to the National Institute of Standards and Technology a request for corrections. Now, as a government agency, and incidentally, they're an arm of the Commerce Department, which is, of course, a cabinet position. So there's direct executive control over that organization through the Commerce Department, which is actually the first problem. That study never should have been undertaken by Nist, because as an arm of the federal government was implicated in the events of the day. In other words, they were supposed to protect us from that attack, and that their protection failed.
Yeah.
And 3,000 people were killed, and many millions of people more were implicated in what came after.
Sure.
So in a case where you want to find out the objective truth about a particular incident, you don't ask one of the parties that was involved in the incident to conduct the study, because for one reason or another, their bias or subjectivity is going to play a part, and that's only to be expected. That's why you have the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, which was originally part of the government agency, the Department of Transportation. And then they realized that when they were studying these accidents, that because they were representing the government, and maybe the government was at fault or had some culpability in these accidents, that it was not a good idea to be having them in charge of the investigation. So the same thing is true here. Nist should not have been put in charge of this investigation, because they're an arm of the executive branch of the government. The executive branch of the government was a party to the incidents of the day. They're not going to be objective. We can't expect that. And so you have to have a separate independent body, and to make sure that the people that are on that body have no direct ties, no conflict of interest, no appearance of conflict of interest. And that's how you would hope to get a reasonable and objective analysis of what happened that day. You know, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, there were 4 or 5 separate government investigations into the events of the day. And in this case, it was only after many people complained, victims, family members complained that there was not going to be investigation. Originally, the administration took the position that there wasn't even going to be an investigation. And then when they did have an investigation, they wanted to put Henry Kissinger in charge of it. And Henry Kissinger, obviously, you know, as somebody that had something to do with foreign policy, was immediately, you know, exposed as somebody that had potential conflict of interest. So then they had another, you know, they put other people in charge of that, and so on and so forth. Even the members of the commission that studied the attacks came out later and said that they thought it was set up to fail. And the Nist investigation, we are saying, was set up to fail too, because the people that were put in charge of making critical decisions as to the examination of the evidence made decisions that led the conclusions away from the actual scientific evidence and what it would have revealed.
And away from the normal procedures and standards by which one would conduct such an investigation. I mean, we haven't even gotten into that, but I imagine their work product was fairly shoddy. Their methodology was shoddy by objective standards.
Well, we've come up with 22 separate decisions that were made in the process of that investigation that were wrong. They were simply not done according to scientific method, not done according to investigations generally. And I can run through them very quickly here.
Oh, please. Yep.
We don't have time to go into them. But the first decision that was made was they made sure that somebody in charge of the investigation made sure that they had agents or people that they could influence at critical junctures, so that when a decision was made as to whether we were going to do A or B, they made sure that that decision was always taken in a direction away from where the investigation actually should have gone. So that's the first thing, was that they were able to put people that they could incentivize into positions of authority within the investigation body itself, and the people that were doing it, so that they could control the direction of the investigation.
Sort of like the way on a train track, you have train tracks that diverge and there's a switch, and you can make the train go to the right or you can make the train go to the left, and they had their guy at the throttle. And tell us, before you tell us some of the other ones, I imagine, like with every objective practice, there are standards, there are normal ways of doing things. I'm going to guess that they made decisions to do things abnormally or against the standard or against the usual practices of the profession. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. That's
okay.
Very accurate. That's a very good observation, because that's exactly what happened. So we'll look at the second major event in this investigation, was the decision to destroy most of the evidence. Now, this was a crime scene. There's laws against tampering with the evidence at a crime scene. Obviously, if you tamper with the evidence, you can control the direction of the investigation. So in the case of the debris from the buildings, most of it was hauled off and recycled, sent to China for recycling. They only saved something like 236 pieces of steel from all three buildings. There were 100 tons of steel there. And they saved less than a few hundredths of 1% of that steel. So that's totally against the protocol that you would normally have for the investigation of a failure. You would want to save as much of that as you could, reconstruct it, and look at it and try to figure out how it came apart based upon what you're looking at and what you can test for. There's tests that you can perform on the steel, chemical analysis. So the destruction of the evidence was a super important decision that was made early on, very early on, and was made by somebody clearly in authority that had the ability to enforce that decision. And they roped off the area. It was contained. There was no access. You could not take pictures.
Really?
They prevented anybody that without a permit that was granted by FEMA, granted by the FBI, that they decided early on they were going to treat this crime scene differently by calling it a, quote, terrorist attack. They then somehow were able to circumvent the normal procedural events that they would have taken at a normal crime scene. So this is the second big key, that something was going on here that was being controlled from inside the investigators, that was not according to the way things were normally done.
So by legally redefining the event, they were able to change the standards by which that event was studied. And,
Exactly.
and we have to ask, how did they know so quickly it was a terrorist event? That's a whole other issue. I made a video based on some footage that I found. The buildings were still burning, and some newscaster was reading a very well-prepared history of Osama bin Laden, who none of us had ever heard of before. And it went on for 5 or 10 minutes. And I'm thinking, the buildings are still, and I saw the video later, I think the buildings are still burning. Who wrote this thing? And clearly we've talked about how engineering's been controlled. And this is not part of our topic. But in the same way you can control engineering with just by handling just a few key points, you can control the news media by handling a few networks and national television networks. And you really only need one person in each network. You need what do they call the news director. He's literally the man he's got the headphone on and he says, go to the video, talk to this guest, read this script. The fellow reading the news doesn't know anything. He doesn't have a clue. He's in a bubble. And so it's actually the guy on the other side of the glass who's running the whole thing. So you only need 3 people, ABC, NBC, CBS, I guess CNN too, Fox, whatever, maybe a few more. If you have just those few people, you can determine the narrative. And the narrative, somebody was, and I'm going off on this in a bit, it's a little off topic, but somebody was clearly motivated to define this as a terrorist event from the first minute. And now I understand why, possibly, because it allowed them to change the rules of how the evidence was handled and documented.
Yeah, I think it's very clear from looking at how the investigation was performed that they didn't follow normal protocol, and somebody was making decisions that were somehow had the authority to countermand what normal procedure was. I'm sure there were many investigators, whether they were from the FBI, the local police, or whatever, that were scratching their heads and saying, this isn't the way things are done, but they didn't have the authority to countermand what was happening. So the immediate evacuation of the evidence was performed, and the scene was scrubbed pretty much. So,
theoretically, I'm just thinking of this. I'd never thought of this before. It was a crime, obviously. It was a crime that took place in a specific jurisdiction, Manhattan. So there should have been legions of law enforcement, fire inspectors, all kinds of people for whom that was their jurisdiction to do the research. And I think by federalizing it from the get-go, suddenly all those people were removed from the process. And as you point out, somebody unknown was able to say, "Oh, get rid of all that evidence. We don't want it around here," in countermanding the way every criminal investigation's ever been done since the beginning of history.
Well, that's what we're looking at. So when we look at that, we say somebody was put in a position to make that decision that could be relied upon to make a decision that was going to make an objective and scientific examination of what had happened to be extremely more difficult.
Gotcha.
Now, they couldn't get rid of all of it because there was eyewitnesses, there were audio recordings, there were TV shots, there were videos, so on and so forth. So that evidence remained, and we were able to work with that. But the steel evidence itself would have been crucial, because if in fact incendiaries and explosives were used to take those buildings down, that evidence would have been manifest in the steel itself.
So you mentioned there's 22 items. I know we can't do them all, but they're fascinating. I wonder if you could tell us a few more on your list.
Okay, well, just very quickly, the third element was they decided not to test for incendiaries, and there were independent tests done of the dust, and evidence of incendiaries and explosives was found. But they have refused to acknowledge that. They refused to do it. And so that was another decision that was made. I mean, considering the fact that the World Trade Center had already been attacked with a bomb in 1973 and killed something like 45 people or something like that, It was a scene of a former terrorist attack using incendiaries and explosives, and yet here you had the structures were destroyed and they didn't test for it. So that was another crucial decision. The fourth decision was that they refused to release their analysis of why the buildings came down. They studied this afterwards. They paid well-known contractors and structural engineering firms perform analyses. They performed their own analyses. They constructed computer models. They had input values and so on and so forth. They've refused to release any of that because they say the release of that information might jeopardize public safety. So that is a decision that is clearly motivated with the same intent.
And they won't even release it to members of the profession who could theoretically, if their version of events is true, could use that information to prevent future disasters of that kind. So
of course, this is a decision that runs completely counter to any kind of understanding of what's going on here. It's just like, what? I mean, it's just hard to fathom.
I mean, imagine if a plane suddenly disintegrated in midair, and then the powers that be would say, well, we don't really want any of the technical information about that to be made available to aeronautical engineers because it might put the world at risk if they had scientific information about a catastrophe. Wow.
Okay, so that's, I mean, these things, you begin to get the drift here of what's going on. The fifth thing is they fabricated a test on the towers about the fireproofing material. One of the central to their claim about why the two towers came down is that when the planes hit the buildings, the debris from the planes scraped off the fireproofing of the steel, and that made the steel in the impact area more susceptible to the fires, and that's what weakened the steel, and that's why the buildings collapsed.
Yep.
Their assertion that the fireproofing was removed by the debris from the plane is extremely suspect. They performed one very amateurish test and then just declared that to be the truth. And actually, when you look at the results of the test, and I won't go into all the details, when you look at the results of the test, it shows that actually the opposite of that is true. The plane debris probably did not remove a significant portion of the fireproofing, and that would not have had an effect on the ability of the steel to withstand the flames. So that's the fifth item, is the problem with the fireproofing material in the buildings and their assertion that most of it was removed. The sixth problem is that the Nist report never does explain the mechanics of how the two towers collapsed. It only goes into the initiating event. That is, the planes hit the buildings, the flames burned in the area where the planes hit, and the combination of the damage from the plane and the weakening of the steel from the fires caused the top portion of the building to fall on the lower portion of the building and collapse it all the way to the ground. But they never present any structural analysis to prove that assertion it has any plausibility whatsoever. Instead, they relied on a paper, and this is a really interesting part. There was a paper submitted to one of the ASCE journals, the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the profession. It was presented to the journal 2 days after the event. On September the 13th, 2001, a professor from Northwestern University by the name of Zdeněk Bezant submitted a paper to the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, which was a theory as to why the towers had collapsed. And essentially, he presented some equations, energy equations, and so on and so forth. And he detailed exactly why he thought the buildings had collapsed due to the impact and the fires. That is still the official story as to why the buildings collapsed. This paper that was submitted 2 days after the event. So that when NIST submitted their report to the public on the tower's failure, They only talked about the initiating event. And then they said global collapse ensued. And then they referred everybody to Besant's paper to explain why the buildings came down. So that's a very suspicious event, especially since we have engineers that have submitted papers to the Journal of Engineering Mechanics subsequent to that, that disproved Besant's theory because he used improper input values. Nothing wrong with his equations, but equations depend upon the values that you put in. And he overestimated the weight of the building above the impact zone, and he underestimated the strength of the columns in the impact zone, and he underestimated the strength of the building below the impact zone, so he could make his equations seem to work. But when you put in the actual values, you find out that his equations don't work and the building wouldn't collapse. They have refused to publish those papers.
So, wow. So a guy who, whipped something together. I don't think that's unfair to say. If an event happens on Tuesday and on Thursday you've already got a paper, you kind of whipped it together pretty fast. Likely to be error. I mean, maybe it was just let's take the most charitable interpretation. He made his best effort. He was working fast. He made some mistakes. Understandable if you're working that fast. But now nobody will allow you guys to just tell the truth about the math involved.
Well, what happened was that the journal didn't publish his paper right away. They published it in January of the next year. So they did wait 3 months. Apparently, they were reviewing it, as they should have, for errors and for miscalculations and so on. But they eventually published it in January. And in the ensuing years, I think in 2007 and 2009, he did publish reports that attempted to correct some of the problems with his report, because people were raising objections, not that the Journal of Engineering Mechanics would publish them, but they were published online. And there were various forums that sprang up online questioning the official narrative. And these questions were beginning to detract from the apparent efficiency or the ability of his paper to explain what happened properly. So he did issue a couple of papers that attempted to answer these objections. However, by 2011, he had sort of painted himself into a corner, and the final paper that really put a nail in his coffin, the last nail in his coffin, then they didn't publish that paper at all, and they have refused any further discussion of it whatsoever. So the journal editors and the people at ASCE that control the publications have had to step in and say, no, we're not going to discuss this anymore, even though they hadn't really published any of the objections up until that point. They were responding to papers that had been published online in public forums. And so the whole thing is unethical. I mean, the way it's handled was unethical and completely counter to the normal methodology of how you would discuss these things.
So the very foundational assumption of the whole story was written and drafted and published by a guy in 2 days. He made obvious errors. He's tried to correct them. They're uncorrectable, apparently. And the society, which controls the commerce of ideas within your profession, has put a ban on discussing this fundamental assumption that was published in 2 days that's riddled with error. That's pretty much where we're at with that?
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
So that's number 6. Okay.
I'm here. I can stay all day. I find this fascinating.
We've still got 16 more to go. And each one of them requires some discussion to really understand them. But my point is that their refusal to discuss any of these matters. As we were talking about, at one point we said we have issued a request for correction. to Nist, and they are by law required to respond. Well, they responded. They waited as long as they could to respond, and they finally responded, and basically they just reiterated their original positions. They didn't respond to any of our very well detailed account of why their account had problems. So that's, we are now taking them into court on that. They are required by law to produce truthful and accurate reports, and they didn't do so. So now we're going to try to get the courts to force them to do so, and that's where we are with that process. We've submitted our appeal of their denial to our request, and we'll see how the courts are going to handle it. We, again, all of our professions are I think, being subjected to this corruption, which seems to be widespread, and we're hopeful that that hasn't reached the level that we happen to be at in the courts, but we'll see. We're pursuing our due diligence. We're following the law and following what the law allows us to do in these situations, and we will continue to do so. And that's where we're going. I don't know if you have time to want to go into the rest of these, or maybe you want to bring me back and we'll talk.
Yeah, maybe let's because it's a lot, and let's do this again and go through the rest of the list. Which court are you being heard by?
I think that's District of Columbia Court.
Okay. Great.
Federal court in the District of Columbia. Well, and by the way, we have another. We're involved in a couple of other legal proceedings. I mean, we presented evidence to the Attorney General in the Southern District of New York to be given to the grand jury. Mm-hmm. We're trying to get our information, and there's hundreds and hundreds of pages of evidence to indicate that the information that was given to the public about the attacks was not accurate, and it was a crime scene, and it occurred in the Southern District of New York, and therefore there should be criminal prosecutions started at that in the Southern District of New York. However, the Attorney General has refused to give the information to the grand jury. So we are now arguing that he does. We are up in the appellate court district in New York, and we're arguing that the Attorney General doesn't have the power to prevent information from being given to the grand jury. The whole notion of having a grand jury is on the preposition that you're trying to prevent political influence determining the fate of criminal investigations. And if you allow the Attorney General to decide what's given to the grand jury or not, then you have destroyed the whole purpose of having a grand jury. No point in having a grand jury if the only information they can get is being given to them, fed to them by the Attorney General. So this is apparently a groundbreaking case. And we are hopeful that the court is going to decide that, in fact, the grand jury has a right to this information, and the Attorney General has no right to withhold it from them. So that's another legal effort that we're pursuing. The third one is in the UK. One of the family members there that was killed in the attack, Jeff Campbell, there was an inquest in the courts in England as to his death, because there's always an inquest in the death of any British citizen under their system of the law. And we're arguing that his family, and we're helping his family present a case that says that all the evidence that was given in the inquest, which says that he died because the buildings collapsed, was not accurate, because the evidence from his body, which which they recovered, and the evidence of other bodies indicated that there were explosions in the building. These were people that were killed by high impact flying debris. And we're saying that if the coroner had known that information, they would not have come to the conclusion that he died as a result of the collapse of the buildings, but that there had to be explosives in the building in order for him to die in the manner in which he died, and others as well.
And
so,
he was on a floor that wouldn't have been impacted by the plane, I'm assuming.
Yeah, well, they're not sure where he was, but we do have, for instance, there's a very well-known case of Bobby Mcelveen was a young man that was killed, and his father has been very active in trying to get at the truth of why he died. His body was recovered. He was apparently in the lobby of the North Tower, and the autopsy of his body indicates that he was killed by high impact explosions that pretty much destroyed the upper part of his body, and that we've had a well-known autopsy specialist. I don't know if you've ever heard of Cyril Wecht. Cyril Wecht is well known because he's been involved in autopsies of famous cases, including JFK. He's still alive. He's 90 years old.
Wow.
Still practicing. He's still very sharp. And he took a look at the evidence of Bobby Mcelveen's autopsy, and he said, this is not a death that was caused by being crushed. Okay, so he's, we've accumulated large bodies of evidence that indicate that the deaths, for instance, you probably heard there were all these fragments of bodies that were found on top of the Deutsche Bank building years afterwards, tiny little fragments of many victims that were identified by DNA. How did little tiny pieces of people's bodies get found, hundreds of yards away on top of another building as a result of a building coming down and crushing?
Yeah.
This is scientifically not plausible, right?
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of evidence that we're trying to get in front of courts and various venues to get a determination that the information that they were giving in regards to the death of these people was not correct, and therefore a criminal investigation should ensue. And from what we have on the ground, looking at the evidence and the way the evidence was handled, we can start from there. We can start with the people on the ground that were involved in the cover-up, and we can work our way up into the levels of people that actually were responsible for the crime.
So it's not just an issue of reclassifying the cause of death. It's actually getting into what was the cause of death,
right?
And how was that obscured,
right? And then you can begin to look at, okay, what was the evidence? Who was handling the evidence? Why were certain decisions made? Why did we can put a group of about 500 people in a room, and we know that some of the people in that room were involved in the cover-up. They were somehow incentivized, whether they were coerced, enticed, threatened. We have no way of knowing why these are not the people that actually planned and organized the crime, but they were drawn into the cover-up because of the position that they held, and they were forced or incentivized in some way to make decisions that led the investigation off in the wrong direction. That's where the investigation needs to begin. Wow. But first of all, we have to have cause to have an investigation by proving that the so-called theory about why the buildings collapsed is not tenable.
Wow, so you've got some good lawyers working with you then.
We're working with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Truth. Mick Harrison is our lead attorney there. He's done some great work, and we really have a lot of confidence in his ability to lay these things out in front of the court in a manner that's going to withstand scrutiny if the courts have any integrity at all.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, this is a discouraging tale, but what is encouraging are people like you and your fellow members at AE911truth.org, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and this brother group, this attorney group that are working together hand in hand with you to bit by bit, step by step, document this information and get it out to the public. But it's clear you're being obstructed, and the natural, normal flow of communications between engineers is being actively interfered with by the people at the top of the engineering society. And this is important for people to realize that this is going on. The website is ae911truth.org. I want to encourage everybody to go and check it out. I want to encourage everyone to be a supporter because there's so many things to support in this world. But again, going back to something I said earlier, civilization depends on civil engineers and the rational application of knowledge to civil engineering projects. And besides the crime involved in destroying and obscuring evidence, there's a larger issue. I mean, how far do these people go? Are they going to start telling us that we don't need to build buildings properly anymore? We don't need to build roads I mean, where does it end? When you start corrupting fundamental objective science and engineering, where does it end? So this is a very important place to draw a line in the sand. And we're very grateful to you and all your colleagues that you're doing this tremendous, I mean, tens of thousands of hours of volunteer effort across the profession. And we've gotten a good picture of how the corruption is systemic and how just unbelievable things are being done, like not allowing engineers to talk with other engineers about matters of engineering. It's not unlike what's going on in our public health and medical world right now too. It's the parallels are striking, but you're showing the way, and I want to thank you so much, Roland, for taking the time. And we will come back, and if we could do the other 16 or however many there are, I know
I'd be glad to point it. It takes a little time to go through it. It is somewhat technical, but it can be understood by people without engineering backgrounds if it's explained carefully. And I'm kind of fortunate in that I at one time had a job teaching engineering subject to high school students, and so I've gotten in the mode of being able to try to explain things in a way that doesn't confuse people with detail and so on and so forth, and try to get to the essence of it.
And it wouldn't be bad for all of us to be a little better educated on things related to engineering. Why not? Why can't we be informed about certain things, especially when they affect us so seriously? Well, Roland, thanks a lot, and we'll definitely come back and go through the other points. I'm looking forward to that. And I want to encourage everybody, AE911truth.org. I'm sure 90%, if not 99% of our viewers already know this group, but I want to remind you of their work. Obviously, current events have swept us away, and some really important issues may not be getting the ongoing attention they deserve. This is a big one. And AE911truth.org, everybody should go. We're going to put a link there, and I hope you not only go and re-inform yourself about what happened 20 and a half years ago, but also that there are dedicated men and women devoting literally thousands of hours on all our behalfs to make sure the truth of this eventually comes out. Thanks, Roland.
Thank you, Ken. I would like to emphasize just one more thing. We are a nonprofit. We depend entirely upon donations. Most of them come in small amounts. We get no grants. We have nobody funding us. We're not connected to the government in any way. Get no corporate support whatsoever. This is entirely a grassroots effort, and we depend upon grassroots support. And we've been very grateful to be able to continue as long as we have, because we've been getting that support, and we hope it will continue. Thank you for your help.
Great. I want to strongly encourage everybody, and Roland, I'm writing a check today myself. It's got it's got to be, because, and Roland points out, this is all coming out of people's pockets. This is not, there's no federal grant, there's no university grant. This is real people doing this at their own expense, and there are a lot of expenses involved in doing high quality engineering analysis, and the legal work too. Legal work sounds very promising. If to have those two forces combined, that is very encouraging.
Well, we're going to keep at it. Nothing's going to stop us.
All right. Okay. So long. Thanks a lot. All right, bye-bye.
Okay, talk next time. Bye-bye.